The Masquerade Revelation. Chapter 1. The Mask and the Mystery. The grand ballroom of Blackwood Manor shimmered like a captive constellation. Thousands of candles floated in crystal chandeliers, their light catching the gilt edges of mirrors and the satin sheen of gowns, fracturing into 1,000 tiny diamonds that danced across the marble floor. It was the annual masquerade of masks, a tradition Lord Edward Hale usually endured with the weary politeness of a man who had seen too many seasons of the same performance. Tonight, however, felt different. Perhaps it was the weight of the black velvet mask against his brow, or the lateness of the autumn air pressing against the tall windows. Or perhaps it was her. He noticed her first as a figure in silver, a gown that flowed like liquid moonlight, unadorned by the heavy jewels other ladies flaunted. Her mask was simple, ivory silk edged with tiny seed pearls, covering everything above her lips. It left only her mouth and chin visible, yet that small expanse of skin seemed to hold more expression than the entire faces of the other guests. She stood alone by the eastern colonnade, a glass of untouched champagne in her gloved fingers, watching the swirling couples with an air of quiet amusement. Edward had been trained since birth to read people, their stations, their ambitions, their secrets. But this woman defied him. Her posture was that of nobility, yet she lacked the brittle sharpness of the titled ladies who circled the room like hawks. She moved with a natural grace, not a rehearsed one. When a servant passed too close and nearly jostled her, she did not scold or flinch. She simply stepped aside, offering the young man a small, genuine smile that transformed her shadowed features. Something in Edward's chest tightened. "You're staring, my lord," murmured his friend, Lord Charles Whitmore, appearing at his elbow with a snifter of brandy. "And not at Lady Penelope, I notice. She will be devastated." "Lady Penelope has 3 other suitors in this room. She will hardly miss my gaze." Charles followed his line of sight and let out a low whistle. The Silver Mystery, bold choice, arriving alone no less. "Do you know her?" "No." "Then why the fascination?" Edward did not answer. He could not explain the pull he felt, the strange certainty that if he let this woman disappear into the crowd without speaking to her, he would regret it for the rest of his life. He had felt such things before, of course. The wild enthusiasms of youth, the fleeting infatuations that burned bright and died fast. But this was different. This was quiet. It felt less like a fire, and more like the slow, steady recognition of a familiar melody heard from a distant room. He set down his glass and began to walk. The crowd parted around him, not out of deference, but because Edward Hale, even masked, carried an authority that preceded him. Tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled against his temple and a jaw that had been called aristocratic more times than he could count, he moved through the world as if it owed him nothing, and he owed it even less. His mask was black velvet trimmed with subtle silver thread, matching his waistcoat. It left his mouth and eyes free, and those eyes, a deep, thoughtful grey, were fixed entirely on the woman in silver. She saw him coming. He watched her register his approach, the slight straightening of her spine, the way her fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on the stem of her glass. But she did not retreat. She did not look away. When he stopped before her, close enough to catch the faint scent of jasmine and rain, she tilted her head in a gesture that was both curious and defiant. "My lord," she said. Her voice was low and warm, with an accent he could not place, not quite London, not quite the country. Educated, certainly, but touched with something rougher, something real. "You know me," he said. It was not a question. "Your reputation precedes you, Lord Hale. Even behind a mask, a man of your stature is not easily disguised." "And yet you are." Her lips curved. It was not a flirtatious smile, nor a coy one. It was the smile of someone who had just won a small private victory. "I have no reputation to precede me. That is the luxury of obscurity. Edward felt a thrill run through him, sharp and unexpected. In a world where every woman he met was either angling for his title or terrified of his scrutiny, this one offered neither. She offered only herself, and even that was hidden behind a mask and a mystery. "May I have the next dance?" he asked. She looked at the dance floor where a waltz was just beginning, the strings swelling, the couples aligning. Then she looked back at him. "You do not even know my name." "No, and that does not trouble you?" "On the contrary," he said, extending his hand, "it is the most interesting thing that has happened to me in years." For a long moment, she did not move. Edward was acutely aware of the eyes that had begun to turn their way. Charles's amused smirk, the whispers of the dowagers, the jealous glances of younger ladies who had hoped to catch his attention. None of it mattered. All that mattered was the silver-masked woman and the decision hovering in the air between them. Then she placed her gloved hand in his. Her fingers were warm through the silk, her grip surprisingly firm. As he led her toward the floor, she said quietly, "You should know that I am not what you expect, Lord Hale." "I expect nothing." "Then you are wiser than most." They began to dance. The waltz was a languid, sweeping thing, all rise and fall, turn and counter-turn. Edward had danced it 100 times with 100 partners, but never like this. The woman in silver moved as if the music lived inside her, every step effortless, every turn perfectly timed. She did not chatter about the weather or the latest on DT. She did not simper or flirt. She simply danced, and in the silence between them a different kind of conversation began. Her body spoke of strength. Her hands, though gloved, were not the soft, useless hands of a lady who had never lifted anything heavier than a fan. He felt calluses beneath the silk, faint, but there. Her posture was that of someone accustomed to long hours and hard work, yet her manners were impeccable. She knew which fork to use, which way to turn, when to incline her head. She was a contradiction, and Edward found himself desperate to solve her. "You are staring again," she murmured, as the waltz carried them past a cluster of potted palms. "I am trying to place you." "Do not bother. I am not in any of the places you know." "Then, where are you from?" "Everywhere. Nowhere." She smiled again, that small, private smile. "I have lived a life of moving, my lord. I am not anchored to a single estate or a single name." "But you have a name. Everyone has a name. Will you not give me yours?" The music swelled toward a crescendo. The dancers turned, and for a moment the candlelight caught her mask just so, illuminating the edge of her jaw, the curve of her cheek. Edward saw, beneath the silk and shadow, a face that was not conventionally beautiful, but was unforgettable nonetheless, strong-browed, clear-eyed, with a mouth that seemed to hold both laughter and sorrow in equal measure. "Call me Juliet," she said. "Juliet," he repeated. The name felt right in his mouth, like a key turning in a lock. "And what is your surname, Juliet?" "That," she said, as the final notes of the waltz faded and she stepped gracefully from his arms, "is the mystery." She curtsied, a perfect, deep curtsy that would have done credit to a duke's daughter, and then she turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd like silver smoke. Edward stood alone on the dance floor, his hand still raised as if expecting her to return and take it again. Around him, the ball resumed its hum of conversation and laughter, but he heard none of it. He heard only her voice, low and warm, and the strange, impossible certainty that he had just met the woman who would change everything. He did not find her again that night. He searched every corner of Blackwood Manor, every salon and terrace and shadowed alcove. He questioned servants, peered behind curtains, even ventured into the moonlit gardens where couples strolled and whispered. But the woman in silver was gone, as if she had never been. The only trace he found was a single white glove dropped on the marble steps of the east colonnade. He picked it up and held it to his face, breathing in the faint scent of jasmine. Then he tucked it into his pocket and went home, knowing he would not sleep. Chapter 2. The Unmasking. For 3 weeks, Edward Hale did nothing but think about her. He told himself it was absurd. He was a man of 32 years, a viscount with an estate to manage and a seat in Parliament to occupy. He had no time for romantic fantasies, no patience for the kind of feverish longing that afflicted lovesick boys. And yet, every morning when he woke, her voice was the first thing he heard. Every night when he closed his eyes, he saw her silver gown and her small, secret smile. He returned to Blackwood Manor 3 times, hoping to find some clue. A guest list, a forgotten handkerchief, a servant who remembered her. But the masquerade had been an open event, its attendees a chaotic mix of the titled and the anonymous. No one knew the woman in silver. No one had seen her arrive or depart. Charles, predictably, found the whole affair hilarious. "You have been thoroughly bewitched, my friend," he said over brandy in Edward's library. "A mystery woman at a masked ball, and now you are moping about like a character in one of Mrs. Radcliffe's novels. What next? Will you write her a sonnet?" "I am considering it," Edward said dryly, and Charles laughed so hard he nearly spilled his drink. But beneath the mockery, Charles was worried. He had known Edward since their shared school days at Eton, and he had never seen him like this, distracted, restless, almost pained. The usual sharpness of Edward's mind had dulled. He stared out windows instead of reading reports, wandered the halls instead of attending to business. It was not healthy, Charles thought. It was not like him at all. The solution, when it came, arrived in the form of an invitation. Lady Ashworth, one of the great hostesses of the season, was throwing a dinner party, a smaller, more exclusive affair than the Masquerade, but still glittering enough to attract the best of society. Edward almost declined, but Charles insisted. "You need to get out of this house," Charles said, plucking the invitation from Edward's fingers. "You need to see real women, with real faces and real names. Perhaps then you will forget your phantom." Edward went, but not because he believed he would forget. He went because something in his gut, that same instinct that had compelled him to cross the ballroom floor, told him that the night was significant, that he would find something there, or someone. Lady Ashworth's dining room was a masterpiece of understated elegance, cream walls, silver candelabras, a long table draped in ivory linen. The guests were a carefully curated mix of the powerful and the interesting, a few peers, a famous painter, an Italian count with excellent English, and a smattering of wealthy merchants' daughters that Lady Ashworth was trying to marry off. Edward took his seat between a dowager duchess who smelled of mothballs and a young woman named Miss Amelia Grey, who talked incessantly about her pug. He nodded and smiled and made the appropriate noises, but his attention was elsewhere, scanning the table, searching for something he could not name. And then he saw her. She was seated at the far end, between a gout-ridden baron and a bishop with magnificent sideburns. Her gown was deep blue tonight, not silver, and her hair was pinned up in a simpler style than the elaborate curls of the other ladies. But Edward would have known her anywhere. The set of her shoulders, the way she held her head, the small private smile that played at the corners of her mouth when she thought no one was watching. His heart stopped. Then it resumed, hammering against his ribs like a caged bird. Her mask was gone. In the unforgiving light of Lady Ashworth's candelabras, he saw her face fully for the first time. High cheekbones, a straight nose, eyes the colour of winter hazel. She was older than he had first guessed, perhaps 28, with fine lines at the corners of her eyes that spoke of laughter and hardship in equal measure. And she was not a lady. He saw that now, in the way her dress, though beautiful, was not of the first quality. In the way her gloves had been mended at the seams. In the way she listened more than she spoke, as if she were afraid of revealing too much. Miss Juliet Norris, Lady Ashworth introduced her, a companion to the Dowager Countess of Marley, a nobody, a ghost. Edward did not care. He waited until the second course, when the conversation had grown loud and the servants were busy with wine, and then he rose from his seat and walked the length of the table to stand beside her chair. "Miss Norris," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. She looked up, and for a fraction of a second he saw fear flash across her face, raw and unguarded. Then it was gone, replaced by the smooth, polite mask she had worn at the Masquerade. "Lord Hale," she said. "What a surprise." "Is it? You were not supposed to recognize me. Then you should not have danced with me." The Baron on her left was deep in conversation with the bishop. No one was paying them any attention. Edward took advantage of the privacy to pull out the empty chair beside her and sit down. "Your name is Juliet," he said. "You told me that much. It is my name. And Norris," she hesitated, "is also my name. But not the one you were born with." Her jaw tightened. For a moment he thought she would lie to him, would invent some plausible story, some respectable lineage that would explain her presence at this table. But instead, she met his eyes directly and said, "No, Norris is my mother's maiden name. My father was a tradesman, a good one, but a tradesman nonetheless. I have no title, no estate, no fortune. I'm a paid companion, Lord Hale. I read aloud to an old woman and write her letters and pretend to be grateful for the scraps of her table." She said it without self-pity, without apology. She said it as if she were stating a fact of nature, like the rising of the sun or the turning of the seasons. Edward looked at her, really looked, and felt something shift inside him. It was not pity. Pity would have been an insult to her courage. It was not even admiration, though he admired her deeply. It was something simpler and more profound, recognition. He saw, in her fierce honesty and her quiet dignity, a mirror of the man he wanted to become. "Why did you come to the Masquerade?" he asked. "Because I wanted, for one night, to be someone else." Her voice dropped, and for the first time, he heard the loneliness beneath it. "I wanted to wear a beautiful gown and dance with a handsome man and pretend that the world was full of possibility. It was selfish, it was foolish, and I do not regret it." "Nor do I." She looked at him then, really looked, and Edward saw the walls behind her eyes begin to tremble. "You should go, my lord. People are staring." "Let them stare," he wanted to say, but he was a gentleman, and she was a woman whose reputation would not survive a scandal. So he rose, bowed, and returned to his seat beside the mothball-scented Duchess. But he did not stop looking at her, and she, despite all her warnings to herself, could not stop looking back. After the dinner ended, Edward found her in the library, a small, dim room at the back of Lady Ashworth's house, where the fire had burned low and the shadows gathered thick. She stood by the window, her blue gown ghostly in the half-light, and she did not turn when he entered. "You should not be here," she said. "Probably not. If anyone sees us, no one will." She turned then, and in the glow of the dying fire, he saw that her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "What do you want from me, Lord Hale? I have nothing to give you. No dowry, no connections, no beauty that will last. I am a servant in everything but name. The only reason I was invited tonight is because Lady Marley is too ill to attend, and Lady Ashworth needed someone to fill her place." "I want you to stop calling me Lord Hale," he said. She blinked. "What?" "My name is Edward. I want you to say it." "That is not proper. I do not care." He stepped closer, close enough to see the pulse beating in her throat, close enough to count the freckles scattered across her nose. She did not retreat. She stood her ground, her hands clenched at her sides, her breath coming fast. "Edward," she whispered, and the sound of his name on her lips was like a prayer. He reached out and took her hand, the left one, the one she had worn a glove over at the Masquerade. He turned it over and saw, in the firelight, the faint calluses on her palm. The marks of a life lived with purpose. "You are not a servant," he said. "You are not a nobody. You are the woman who danced with me when she had nothing to gain and everything to lose. You are the woman who looked at me and saw not a title, but a man. And I will not let you disappear again." "Edward." Her voice broke. "I am going to call on you tomorrow," he said. "At Lady Marley's house. I am going to bring flowers, and I am going to ask your permission to court you properly. And if you say no, I will ask again the next day, and the next, until you say yes." She stared at him, her hazel eyes wide with something that looked like terror and wonder intertwined. "You cannot mean that." "I have never meant anything more in my life." For a long moment, the world contracted to the space between them, the warmth of the fire, the whisper of the curtains, the steady beat of his heart, and the fragile racing beat of hers. Then, slowly, she smiled. Not the small, secret smile of the Masquerade, but something bigger, brighter, more real. "You are a fool, Edward Hale," she said. "I know. A complete and utter fool." "I am aware." She laughed, a startled, breathless sound that seemed to surprise even her. And then, before she could talk herself out of it, she rose on her toes and pressed a kiss to his cheek. It lasted only a second. But Edward felt it for hours afterward, long after he had left the library, long after he had ridden home through the cold autumn night. He felt it like a brand, like a promise, like the beginning of something he had spent his whole life waiting for. Chapter 3. The Revelation. They courted for 2 months, and Edward was happier than he had ever been. He called on Juliet at Lady Marley's townhouse every afternoon, bringing small gifts, a book she had mentioned wanting to read, a bundle of dried lavender for her room, a drawing he had made of the view from his study window. They walked together in Hyde Park, their steps slow and their conversation endless. They attended the theatre, sitting in the cheap seats because Juliet refused to let him pay for the box, and they laughed until their sides ached at a farce so terrible it circled back to genius. She told him about her life. The father who had lost his fortune in a shipping venture gone wrong, the mother who had died of a broken heart, or so Juliet always said with a wry twist of her lips, the years of scraping by as a governess and then a companion. She told him about the loneliness of being neither fish nor fowl, too educated to be a servant, too poor to be a lady. She told him about the night of the Masquerade, how she had borrowed the silver gown from a sympathetic dressmaker and snuck out of Lady Marley's house like a thief in the night. "I wanted one perfect evening," she said. "I did not expect it to lead to this." "To what?" She looked at him across the small table of a tea shop, her hazel eyes soft. "To being seen." Edward took her hand and kissed her fingers, one by one. "You will always be seen by me, Juliet. Always." But even as he said it, a shadow passed over her face, quick as a cloud crossing the sun. He noticed it, as he noticed everything about her, but he did not ask. He told himself it was nothing, a remnant of old pain, perhaps, or a natural caution that would fade with time. He was wrong. The revelation came on a rainy Tuesday in December, when the fog had settled over London like a shroud, and the streets ran with mud. Edward was in his library, drafting a letter to his estate manager, when Charles burst through the door without knocking, a breach of etiquette so severe that Edward looked up in alarm. "You need to see this," Charles said, his face pale. He thrust a newspaper onto the desk. It was folded to the society pages, where a familiar name leapt out in bold print. The lost heiress of Thornwood Hall. Edward read the article with growing horror. It told the story of a young woman named Juliana Thornton, the only child of a wealthy baronet who had disappeared from her home at the age of 18 under mysterious circumstances. She had been presumed dead, her fortune absorbed by a distant cousin. But now, 15 years later, a series of letters had surfaced, letters that suggested Juliana Thornton was not dead at all, that she was living in London under an assumed name, that she was, in fact, the woman known as Miss Juliet Norris. Edward's hands began to shake. "It cannot be," he said. "Read the description," Charles said grimly. "Age 8 and 20, hazel eyes, brown hair, a distinctive scar on her left wrist from a childhood fall." Edward closed his eyes. He had seen that scar, a thin white line, barely visible unless you knew to look. He had kissed it once, thinking it was just another mark of her hard-won life. "There is more," Charles said quietly. "The cousin who took her fortune, Sir Reginald Thornton, is fighting the claim. He says the letters are forgeries. He says Juliana Thornton is either dead or an imposter. But the papers are already taking sides, and the scandal—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "Edward, if she is who they say she is one of the wealthiest heiresses in England. But if she is not, she is a fraud. Either way, your name is about to be dragged through the mud." Edward stood up so fast his chair toppled backward. "I do not care about my name." "You should. Your reputation, your seat in Parliament, your family's legacy." "I said I do not care." He was already moving toward the door, grabbing his coat, his hat, his gloves. Charles tried to stop him, but Edward shook him off with a force that surprised them both. "Where are you going?" Charles demanded. "To find her, before the vultures do." He rode through the fog-shrouded streets at a dangerous speed, his heart pounding harder than it had on the night of the masquerade. The world blurred around him, the lamps, the carriages, the faces of strangers, all of it meaningless except for the single thought that drove him forward: Juliet. She would be afraid. She would be alone. And she would be waiting, whether she knew it or not, for him to come. Lady Marley's townhouse was dark when he arrived, save for a single candle burning in the upstairs window. The butler tried to turn him away. Lady Marley was unwell, Miss Norris was not receiving, but Edward pushed past him and took the stairs 2 at a time. He found her in her small room at the back of the house, sitting on the edge of her narrow bed. She was still in her day dress, her hair coming loose from its pins, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. The newspaper lay open on the floor beside her. She did not look up when he entered. She did not need to. "You know," she said, "I know. And you came anyway. I told you I would always come." She laughed then, a broken, hollow sound that cut him to the bone. "You are a fool, Edward Hale, the biggest fool in all of England." "So you have said." "My name is not Juliet Norris." Her voice cracked. "It never was. My father was not a tradesman. He was Sir Henry Thornton, baronet, and I ran away from home when I was 18 because I could not bear the life he had chosen for me. He wanted me to marry a man twice my age, a cruel, brutish man who had already buried 2 wives. I begged him to reconsider, I pleaded, and when he refused, I packed a bag and I left." She finally looked up, and Edward saw that her eyes were red-rimmed, her cheeks wet with tears she had not bothered to wipe away. "I changed my name. I took my mother's maiden name, Norris, and I buried Juliana Thornton so deep that I thought she would never be found. I worked as a governess, a seamstress, a companion. I was poor, but I was free. And I was happy, Edward. For the first time in my life I was happy. Until now. Until now." She gestured to the newspaper. "My cousin Reginald has been looking for me for years, not because he wants to reunite our family, but because he wants to stop me from claiming my inheritance. He has spent 15 years spending money that was never his, and he will not give it up without a fight. So he has hired lawyers and private investigators, and God knows who else, and now the whole world knows my secret." Edward crossed the room and knelt before her, taking her cold hands in his. Then let them know. Let them say what they will. It does not change who you are. You do not understand. She pulled her hands away, her voice rising. I lied to you. From the very first moment, I lied. I told you I was nobody, and I let you believe it. I let you court me, let you fall in love with a woman who does not exist. Juliet. My name is Juliana. The cry tore from her throat, raw and anguished. Juliana Thornton. And I am so tired of pretending to be someone else, but I am also terrified of being her. She is the girl who ran away, the girl who abandoned her family and her name and her future. She is a coward, Edward, and I do not know if you can love a coward. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the rain seemed to pause, holding its breath. Edward looked at her, this woman he had danced with, laughed with, fallen asleep dreaming of. He saw the fear in her eyes, the shame, the desperate hope that he would not turn away, and he made his choice. You are not a coward, he said quietly. You were 18 years old, and you were trapped, and you found a way out. That is not cowardice, that is courage. But I lied. You protected yourself. There is a difference. He reached up and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away her tears. I fell in love with Juliet Norris. It is true. But Juliet Norris was not a lie. She was you. The best part of you. The part that dances in silver gowns and smiles at servants and reads books by candlelight because the world is full of stories worth knowing. That woman is real. That woman is standing in front of me right now. And I do not care what name she uses. Juliana, Juliet, shook her head, a fresh wave of tears spilling down her cheeks. You should hate me. I should do a great many things that I have no intention of doing. He stood, pulling her gently to her feet. I intend to marry you, if you will have me. I intend to stand beside you while you fight your cousin for every penny that is rightfully yours. I intend to spend the rest of my life reminding you that you are not a coward, but a survivor, and I intend to start right now. He kissed her. It was not the soft, tentative kiss of the library. It was fierce and desperate, and full of all the words they had not yet said. I trust you. I choose you. I will never leave. When they finally broke apart, she was trembling, but she was also smiling, that real radiant smile he had first seen in Lady Ashworth's library. You are a fool, she whispered. You're fool, he agreed. Yes, she said, and her voice was steady now, strong. Yes, you are. Chapter 4. The Truth That Sets Them Free. The months that followed were the hardest of their lives. Sir Reginald Thornton did not give up quietly. He hired the best lawyers in London, flooded the newspapers with insinuations and outright lies, and did everything in his power to paint Juliana as a fraud, a scheming adventuress who had invented her identity to steal a fortune that did not belong to her. The case went to court in the spring, and for 6 weeks, Juliana sat in the witness box and endured a barrage of questions designed to break her. But she did not break. Edward sat in the gallery every day, his hands clenched on the railing, watching the woman he loved defend herself with a grace and courage that left him breathless. She told the truth, all of it, the shame and the fear and the desperate flight of a frightened girl. She produced letters from her mother, her old governess, even a former servant who had helped her escape. She submitted to handwriting analysis and witness testimony and the cruel, probing questions of Sir Reginald's barrister. And in the end, she won. The verdict came on a bright June morning, delivered by a judge with silver hair and kind eyes. Juliana Thornton was declared the rightful heir to Thornwood Hall and all its accompanying fortunes. Sir Reginald was ordered to repay every penny he had taken, plus interest. And the newspapers, ever fickle, turned their attention to a new scandal, leaving Juliana to pick up the pieces of her life. She did not want Thornwood Hall. She had not set foot in the place since she was 18, and she had no desire to return. Instead, she sold it, every stone, every acre, every ghost, and used the money to endow a school for girls. A school where no young woman would ever have to choose between a cruel marriage and a life on the streets. Edward proposed to her on the steps of that school, on the day they broke ground for its construction. He did not kneel, the ground was too muddy, but he took her hands in his and looked into her hazel eyes and asked the question he had been waiting to ask for nearly a year. "Juliana Thornton," he said, "will you marry me?" She laughed, that startled, breathless sound he loved so much. "You are still a fool, Edward Hale." "I know. I have no mask to hide behind now. You have seen me at my worst. You have seen me broken and afraid and fighting for my life. And you are still here. I will always be here." She looked at the school behind her, the half-built walls, the scaffolding, the future rising from the mud. Then she looked at him. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you." They were wed in a small country church, with only Charles and a handful of trusted friends in attendance. Juliana wore a simple white dress, no jewels, no mask. Edward wore a black coat and a smile that would not fade. As they walked back down the aisle together, her hand in his, she leaned close and whispered, "Do you remember the masquerade?" "I remember everything. I was so afraid that night. Afraid of being seen, afraid of being known. And then you walked across the ballroom floor, and for the first time in 15 years, I wanted someone to see me." Edward stopped in the doorway of the church, the summer sunlight spilling over them both. He turned to face her, this woman of silver and steel, of secrets and truth, and he saw, not the mystery, not the heiress, not the fugitive. He saw Juliet, his Juliet. "I see you," he said, and she smiled, not the small secret smile of a woman in hiding, but the full, brilliant smile of a woman finally, irrevocably free. "I know," she said. "That is why I love you." They walked out of the church together, into a future that held no masks, no lies, no running. Only the truth, and the love that had survived it. The end. Thank you, dear reader of the Regency Gazette, for joining us in another tale of love, intrigue, and whispered ballroom secrets. If today's romance delighted you, kindly bestow a like upon this video. It helps our Gazette reach more lovers of Regency storytelling. For weekly journeys into dukes, debutantes, scandals, and slow-burning devotion, please subscribe to the Gazette